Welcome back. Last time we practiced translating English sentences with suffix pronouns into good hieroglyphic sentences. Then, since we did so many English to hieroglyph sentences, as a reward, I gave you only 2 hieroglyph to English sentences. Let's start with our first sentence. The first word is pronounced dejed, and we know it means to say or speak. Then comes the suffix pronoun. Well, I'm sure you looked it up, and you found that it's pronounced chen, and it means you or your. Since it's attached to the verb, it must be you. You speak. Next is ren, the word for name. We see that the same suffix pronoun is attached to name, which is a noun, so it must be your. So we have you say your name. Now the water sign. That's two, as in two people, and is pronounced simply en. Now the question is, to whom? The answer is a scribe. We have the word for scribe, sesh. But there's one more word, pen, which is the masculine form of this. So our sentence means something like, you say or tell your name to this scribe. Good. Isn't it a lot easier going from hieroglyphs to English than the other way? Now for the next sentence, the long one. We'll have to take this one a word at a time. It's very long. First word is hab, to send. Well, the next word is pronounced it. Remember the viper F in the word father is silent? So it's the father who's sending. Next we have the pin-tailed duck. That's the sa biliteral. When it's used to indicate the word son, it is often followed by the stroke and a man determinative. So that's the word for son. Tacked on to son is the viper, so it must be his son. The viper is our suffix pronoun for his. So the father is sending his son. Where? Well, we have a mouth sign next, which is the word for to, in the direction of things or places. So he must be going to a place. Yes, we recognize the next word as town, and it's pronounced niwit. The father is sending his son to the town. Now we have another verb. So either we have a compound sentence or 2 sentences. The verb dejed is to tell or say. And we have the horn viper suffix, so it's he. What is he going to tell or say? A secher, a plan. And he's going to tell it to, there's the water hieroglyph for to, with regard to people. He's going to tell it to the sesh, to the scribe. So, the father sends his son to town to tell his plan to the scribe. That's our homework. Just 2 sentences. We haven't covered everything we need to know about suffix pronouns. So let me just add a few more points. First, let me tell you about an unusual feature of the Middle Egyptian language. We've seen that as in English, suffix pronouns can be either singular or plural. But Egyptian also has a dual. There are suffix pronouns used only for 2 people, for pairs. They're exactly the same as the plurals, except instead of 3 strokes, which is for plural, they have only 2 strokes. Also, these strokes are drawn at an angle. For example, for we, in the plural, the suffix pronoun is the water sign with 3 vertical strokes. Well, for the dual, if there were only 2 of us, it would be the water sign with 2 slanted strokes. Same for you. In the plural, the suffix pronoun is the tethering ring, water sign, and 3 strokes. For the dual, we just have 2 strokes. Last, for they or their, in the plural, we'd have the folded cloth, water sign, and 3 strokes. For the dual, we simply change the 3 strokes to 2 and put them at an angle. The duals are pronounced a bit differently than the plurals. They have a Y sound at the end. So for example, as we've seen, the plural for they is pronounced sen. For the dual, we have 2 strokes, and it's pronounced something like seni. This Y ending for duals doesn't just apply to suffix pronouns, it holds for all nouns too. For example, the word for obelisk is pronounced techen. Add this one to your dictionary if you haven't already. Well, if we're talking about a pair of obelisks, then the word would be pronounced techeni, something like that. So now, if you see 2 strokes at an angle, think dual. One more thing about suffix pronouns. They can be used after prepositions. For example, this could be to me. Here's another example. We see our familiar word together with, henna, and the cloth suffix pronoun for she or her following it. So we have together with her. Let's try translating a couple of sentences from English to hieroglyphs to become familiar with our new uses of personal pronouns. How about we, in the dual, send our scribe to him? This sentence lets us use 2 new uses for our personal pronouns, the dual pronoun and a pronoun coming after a preposition. Let's try it. We start with our verb, hab, to send. That's the easy part. The little determinative suggests walking, as in sending someone out. Now we want to use the dual form of we. Well, the normal plural we is the water sign with 3 strokes. For the dual, we simply have 2 strokes instead of 3. That's we send when it's 2 of us sending. We are sending our scribe. So we first need scribe. There he is. Then we can add our, but it has to be in the dual, since the we was dual. So again, we add the water sign with the 2 strokes. Now for the him part, right? To him. We are going to use our suffix pronoun after the preposition to. We need the water sign to because it is to him, a person. Now for the him. We can add the personal pronoun, which is the horned viper him. And that's it. We send our scribe to him. Good. Let's do one more for practice. How about they, in the dual, tell the secret to him, and then he tells the secret to their father. We start with the verb, to say or speak or tell. Dejed. Now we need they in the dual. Again, the normal plural for they is the folded cloth and water sign with 3 strokes. For the dual, we merely substitute 2 strokes for the 3. Good. Next is secret, seshta. Now we need to him. So we use the water sign for to and the viper for him. The and then is understood. So next comes our verb, to tell. Again, he is a pronoun quite familiar to us by now. We all remember that it's the horned viper F. Now we need seshta again. Next, we need the to, which is the water sign. It's getting easy. Now we need father, which because of the silent viper in it, everyone seems to remember. It's pronounced it. Now we add there, but in the dual, because the sentence began with they in the dual, telling the secret. So we use the folded cloth, water sign, and 2 strokes. Good. And that's it. They tell the secret to him, and he tells the secret to their father. He's a tattletale. I hope suffix pronouns are becoming more familiar. They're very important. Remember, this is only, the middle of the course. And look what you can do. You understand something about Egyptian grammar. You know the verb comes at the beginning. You're comfortable with a small group of verbs and nouns. And you can actually translate some real Egyptian sentences. I'm sure that after another dozen or so lectures, you will be able to translate inscriptions on objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb. That's what we'll do in our last 2 lectures. Let me just say a word about the language of the inscriptions in Tutankhamun's tomb and the New Kingdom in general. As you know, we are learning what is called Middle Egyptian, which is the language spoken during the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC. Like any language, the ancient Egyptian language changed over the centuries. Think about how much English has changed. Old English, the language in which Beowulf is written, is almost unintelligible to the modern reader. Middle English, the language of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, takes quite a bit of effort to understand. The opening sentence, or at least part of the opening sentence, of the prologue is still quite removed from modern English. Let me give you an example. Wandert April with his sword sota, the dracht of March hath passed to the rota, and bother every vein in swish liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. That was written in the 14th century. Think how different our spoken language is now. So how can we, learning Middle Egyptian, expect to translate objects in Tutankhamun's tomb that were crafted during the New Kingdom, centuries after Middle Egyptian was spoken? The answer is what linguists and art historians call archaizing, hearkening back to the good old days. In the New Kingdom official documents, temple walls, etc., they were still using Middle Egyptian as the official language. The Egyptians didn't like change. So Tut's New Kingdom treasures have Middle Kingdom inscriptions on them. So I promise, if you do your homework, you will be able to translate Tut's treasures. Now, speaking of homework, let me give you just 2 sentences to translate. First, they, in the duel, fared down together with her. That's your first one. Second, this land is in joy when you, duel, are in the sky. For this sentence, imagine the sun and moon as the you, so the duel will make sense. Let's just do those 2 for homework. Now, let's do a bit of applied hieroglyphs. It's time to see how a little knowledge of hieroglyphs might help answer some biblical questions. Of all the books in the Bible, Exodus is most closely associated with Egypt, and all the narratives in the Bible, Exodus is mentioned more often than any other, usually in connection with the establishment of Israel as a state. But there's a mystery about Exodus. As important as it is, there's little archaeological evidence for the events it relates. There's no record of a large number of Israelites in Egypt. No mention of anyone named Moses. And even the word Israel is only mentioned once in all the thousands and thousands of hieroglyphic texts. So many scholars have wondered if the events of Exodus actually happened. Could it be just a story? My belief is that with a little knowledge of hieroglyphs, we might be able to shed some light on this question. There are 3 stages to the book of Exodus: bondage, the Exodus, and the Promised Land. Let's start with bondage. We are told in the Bible that there came to the throne a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. If you know your Joseph story, you'll remember that Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt by his jealous brothers, but rose to become the vizier of Egypt. But this was centuries before Exodus, so it's not surprising that the Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. Note that Pharaoh is not named. Nowhere in the book of Exodus is the Pharaoh named. But I think we may be able to figure out who he is. The Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, who was also called Israel, have become numerous. And as This really bothers Pharaoh. This was basically an early immigration problem. So he puts a taskmaster over them and enslaves them. They are building in brick for the Pharaoh. This is an important detail. Notice, it's not stone. It's a common misconception that the Israelites built the pyramids. I remember when Menachem Begin, the former prime minister of Israel, stood in front of the pyramids with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1977. It was a great event. And Begin said, "We built the pyramids." Wrong. The Bible even tells us the Israelites were building the store cities of Ramses and Pitum. Note that one of the cities is named Ramses. So the Pharaoh must be named Ramses. But the problem is, which Ramses? There were lots of pharaohs named Ramses. So the Israelites are laboring in brick to build store cities. But Pharaoh's unhappy because they're too numerous. He says to the midwives, "Watch the two stones." The two stones refer to the birthing stools that Egyptians used to give birth. They gave birth squatting, sitting down. This makes some sense since gravity helps the baby descend from the birth canal. And here are the hieroglyphs for birth. You can see the woman is not lying down, she's squatting. And there's the baby coming out. So Pharaoh tells the midwives to kill the male infants when they're born. The girls are allowed to live. But even with this directive from Pharaoh, the Israelites prosper. Pharaoh asks the midwives, "Why?" And they reply, "Those Israelite women are strong and they give birth before we arrive." One Israelite child's mother was worried that her son would be killed. So she put him in a basket and set him adrift on the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket, adopts the baby, and names him Moses. Now, traditionally, scholars tell us that she gave him that name because she drew him out of the reeds, and Moshe in Hebrew means to draw out. But why would an Egyptian princess speak Hebrew? And would she give him a Hebrew name? It doesn't make sense. Well, what does Moses mean in ancient Egyptian? Remember the hieroglyphs, Moses, that Champollion figured out meant birth? It makes more sense that an Egyptian princess would give her newfound baby an Egyptian name, meaning birth. Once again, hieroglyphs help answer a biblical question. Why does Moses have the name he does? It also lends a bit of credibility to the Exodus story. The details ring true, just as the midwives being told to watch the bricks rings true. So Moses grows up in an Egyptian household, but has an encounter with the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, who appears to Moses as a burning bush. Yahweh tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him, "Let my people go." It's the Charlton Heston moment. Moses doesn't think he can do it. So Yahweh tells him to throw down his staff, his walking stick, and it turns into a snake. He next withers Moses' hand and tells him to put it in his cloak and draw it out, and the hand is restored. Moses is going to have supernatural powers, but he's still hesitant. He's slow of speech. He may stutter. So Yahweh lets Moses bring his brother, Aaron, to do the talking. Moses has an audience with Pharaoh. As I said before, Pharaoh is never named. He's just called Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is not an Egyptian word. The word for king was Nesu, right? As you can see, there's a silent T in there. But Pharaoh is what the Israelites call him. So what does Pharaoh mean in ancient Egyptian? Well, the two hieroglyphs that make up the sound Pharaoh are per, the house, and ah, the biliteral that means great. So the Pharaoh is the guy who lives in the great house. Remember, the Israelites are foreigners. They don't speak the language that well. Pharaoh is a foreigner's way of saying king, the guy who lives in the big house. After the time of Exodus, the word Pharaoh will enter the Egyptian language to mean king. This is still another hieroglyphic detail that lends support to Exodus being a record of a historical event. During his audience with Pharaoh, Aaron throws down his staff, just like Yahweh instructed, and it turns into a snake. But this doesn't impress Pharaoh. His magicians do the same thing with their staves. It must have been the old snake trick that everybody knew. I wondered about this. Many years ago, I decided to find out if such a trick were possible. The town of Esna, near Luxor, was famous for its snake charmers. So I went there to see if anyone could reproduce the trick as it's described in the Bible. Sure enough, the first snake charmer we saw took a cobra, stroked it under its neck, and rather quickly it went rigid like a staff. Then the snake charmer gently tossed it to the ground, and it reared up, just like in the Bible. Still, Aaron's snake swallows those of Pharaoh's magicians, so that's a bit of a victory. In this episode with the magicians, our knowledge of hieroglyphs can once again help us determine if there's any truth to the Exodus story. Here, we're actually going to need a bit of Coptic. You'll remember that Coptic is the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written by the Egyptians who converted to Christianity in the early days of the religion. Well, Coptic is still used in the liturgy of the Coptic Church, like Latin was used in the Catholic Church. The Coptic Bible contains the Exodus story, and what's interesting for us is the Coptic word for magician. It's seshbaranch. Now, remember that Coptic is just a different script for writing the ancient Egyptian language. So let's try to think of what hieroglyphic symbols correspond to the sound in seshbaranch. Well, sesh is our word for scribe, per is the house sign, and ankh is the ankh. When we put them together, we get sesh per ankh, scribe of the house of life. Priests in ancient Egypt were educated in a school called the House of Life. So Pharaoh's magicians were priests. This detail shows that whoever wrote down the Exodus story had an intimate knowledge of ancient Egypt. Anyway, Pharaoh doesn't let the Israelites go. Worse, he tells them they still have to make their bricks, but the straw won't be supplied. They have to gather and chop it themselves. They're not making bricks without straw. This is a common misconception. In the 19th century, there were biblical scholars running throughout Egypt looking for bricks made without straw as evidence of the Exodus. The Israelites were going to have to gather their own straw and still have the same quota of bricks. Not only that, they were not going to get their 3-day religious holiday. So, next comes the 10 plagues. The Nile turns to blood. The Egyptians are tormented with frogs, lice, boils, locusts, darkness, all that bad stuff. All intended to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. But this doesn't soften Pharaoh's heart. He still won't release them. Then comes the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, even among the cattle. Yahweh tells Moses to take the blood of a lamb and paint it above the doorsills of the Israelites, so the angel of death will know to pass over that household and spare the firstborn. That's why Jews celebrate Passover. The angel of death passed over their ancestors' households. When Pharaoh's firstborn son dies, he relents and finally lets the Israelites go. Thus ends bondage, and the Exodus begins. Yahweh tells the Israelites to plunder Egypt, and they leave with gold and silver. How many leave? The Bible says 600,000 men, not including their families. This is a very large number of people, and this has led many scholars to question the Exodus story. The entire population of Egypt at about this time may have been only 1 million. So the number is clearly too large to have happened the way it's told in the Bible. As you'll remember, soon after the Israelites depart, Pharaoh has a change of heart and pursues them in chariots. Often it's said that Pharaoh's army perishes in the Red Sea. But that's a bad translation of the Hebrew Yam Suf, which means Sea of Reeds. We don't know exactly where this marshy area was, but it parts for the Israelites and then closes to swallow Pharaoh's army. Next, the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years, till they reach the Promised Land. The Israelites finally find the land of milk and honey and settle. Their wanderings are over. We've seen several places where knowledge of hieroglyphs has added some evidence that the Exodus actually took place. But there's one more bit of hieroglyphic evidence for the story, and it's the most interesting of all. As you will remember, a stela was a round-top stone with an inscription carved on it. This is where we get the idea of a tombstone from, I think. Well, there's a stela in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that is absolutely unique. It's the only place in the Egyptian record where Israel is mentioned. Now, according to the biblical account, Ramses' firstborn son died during the 10th plague, along with the other firstborn Egyptians. From Egyptian records, we know that Ramses' firstborn son was Amun-Her-Khepchef. A Khepchef was a curved sword, so his name means Amun is upon my sword. When Amun-Her-Khepchef dies, we have to figure out when it happens. We'll see a bit later. Ramses ruled for 67 years. So many of his sons died before him. And it's his 13th son, Merneptah, beloved of Ptah, who succeeds him. Now, this stela in the Egyptian Museum was carved during the 5th year of Merneptah's reign. Merneptah's bragging about all his victories over foreigners. And he says, Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam has been made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, and its seed is not. This is the first and only mention of Israel in the Egyptian record. For this reason, many people believe that Merneptah is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But it's important to note that he's not talking about the Exodus. He's talking about battles outside of Egypt. He's listing all the countries beaten up. So you can see the puzzle about Exodus. It's repeatedly put forward in the Bible as history, in considerable detail, but the archaeological record is kind of blank on the subject and doesn't support Exodus as a historical event. I don't think the debate has to be end here. My belief is that with a little knowledge of hieroglyphs, we might be able to come to some conclusions about whether Exodus occurred. Let's look at the Merneptah stela to see what we can figure out. First, let's see how Israel's spelled. You can make it out. There's a reed, the bolt Z, and other hieroglyphs we're familiar with. See, there's a mouth used for the L. But more important, if you look at all those countries Merneptah's talking about, Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, at the end of each of them is the determinative hieroglyph for a foreign land. It's the 3 mountain sign. But when Merneptah refers to Israel, we don't have the 3 hills to designate a foreign country. Look closely at what we have. Can you figure out what the hieroglyphs are? It's not easy. They're roughly done, basically scratched into the stone. It's the hieroglyphs for people, a man and a woman. In other words, at this point in time, Israel is not a place, not an established country. Why not? They're still wandering in the desert. So during the time of Merneptah, they have not yet established themselves as a nation. Now, if we count backwards from year 5 of Merneptah, when the Israelites were still wandering, we come to the reign of Ramses the Great. The Exodus must have happened during his reign. The great Egyptologist and biblical scholar Kenneth Kitchen even suggests a year when the Exodus took place. Remember Amenhotep, Ramses' firstborn? We know from other records he died around the 20th year of his reign. So that may be when the Exodus occurred. The math isn't exact, but it's close enough to add credence to the Exodus story. It occurred during the reign of Ramses, and the Israelites were still wandering during the early years of Merneptah. So our knowledge of hieroglyphs helps support the idea that the Exodus probably was a historical event. It wasn't exactly as portrayed in the Bible, but something happened. I'll see you next time.